Even know that trees bloomed. I just never even thought about it. It changed my life for sure. But you know, I didn't win 6 hives in a poker game, and I actually went right to work, working for commercial guys out of Vermont. I met friends in college who knew an apiary with 1,000 hives up in Vermont, and they said I could park my van out back of the honey house and just camp out and go and get stung for a living. And that's exactly what I did. Even on the first day, before I got my first bee veil on, I walked into this yard with probably 30 or 40 hives in Vermont, and I guess I just wasn't walking right, or I was stomping around too heavily, but the bees came at me. I got stung 7 or 8 times. They got caught in my hair and stung me in the neck and forehead, and I freaked out. I ran out of there. I ran a couple hundred yards. The bees started settling down. I caught my breath, and I sat down, started picking stingers out of my neck, and I looked at this beautiful blue sky and this green field on this Vermont spring day, and I waited to see if I was going to die. And I didn't die. Somehow I finished out that first day. For some reason, I came back the next day, and at that point I was totally hooked on beekeeping. I realized it was the hardest thing I had ever done. And for that reason, I wanted to stick with it. And that was 17 years ago. And I don't open with this story to intimidate you newbies or those of you who don't have bees yet. These days, getting stung is my favorite part of keeping bees. If you don't get stung, the honey doesn't taste as sweet. But really, beyond the physical benefits that we know, bee venom can reduce and reverse arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and just having a little venom in your blood seems to boost your immune system. Beyond all those clinically proven things that we know that happen to us physically, psychologically, bees give us this gift of being in the moment. Every time I open a beehive, I have to be present. I have to be aware, and I have to slow down. Whereas all my life up to that point, people have been telling me to speed up. That doesn't work with honeybees. They're very good teachers. You have to go slow. You need these zen, deliberate, very focused actions. Otherwise, you get stung. But that being said, every time I open up a hive these days, it's a meditation. And I'm totally in the moment. So another one of the gifts that bees bring us. But let's start with this relationship here. Bees and people. People and bees. What is going on? Well, the way I see it, it's not CCD, not colony collapse disorder. It's more like PCD, people collapse disorder. Honeybees, we figure, have been around for 50 or 60 million years. I think they have the ability to solve problems. They've created diversity. They've been the catalyst for diversity all the way around the world just by how they eat, moving pollen from one plant to the next, creating these niche, evolutionary little microcosms, creating all these different flowering species around the world. Whereas humans these days, we're doing just the opposite. We go to a landscape, we sterilize it, just put in row farms, all just one thing growing. It almost looks suicidal compared to the way that honeybees work. I think we have a lot to learn. And bees, as a precedent, have a lot to teach us. So, I went to work for this 1,000-hive apiary in Vermont, and the first thing they told me was that the bees were dying. They were sick, it was hard to get them through a winter, it was hard to make ends meet in a business. But at the same time, I knew of hives like this. This was in upstate New York, that this hive had survived for over 20 years, living every year with no medications, no supplemental feed, and not only were they thriving on their own, but they were propagating themselves. They were swarming a couple times a year and spreading their genetics out into the landscape. So what was the difference between these bees that seemed to be just fine and the ones that beekeepers were trying to keep alive in their boxes? Well, I was 21 years old when I got started, and I was really just there to learn. And, you know, it seemed that all my friends were moving to Brooklyn in New York City, so I decided on a whim to move out to Montana that fall. And I got a job with a beekeeper out of the phone book my very first day in Montana. I signed up for a 5,000 hive operation. We had 4 hives on a pallet, we put 500 hives in a semi-truck, and we shipped them down to Central California in the fall. And then come February, they pollinated the almonds. We rented those bees out for a couple weeks during the almond bloom. After that bloom, we scooped up those bees, we brought them up to Washington State to pollinate apples. Then we brought them back to Montana, we pollinated cherries, melons, They made a little bit of honey through the rest of the year, but mostly we were just revamping these bees to run this pollination gauntlet. Again, it was like a bug race. These beekeepers, these commercial guys running thousands and thousands of hives are the hardest working, most innovative people I know. Also, commercial beekeepers are some of the most miserable people that you will meet. Not all of them, but these guys have worked so hard. It used to be easy that they could just stay at home and make a living selling honey. These days, over 80% of the honey consumed in this country is coming in from overseas at pennies a pound. Guys like this can't compete with that. So they're doing this migratory pollination in order to support their families, support their payroll, and they're also supporting the food production in America. We're basically growing food in a bell jar, complete control. Monoculture farms are just one thing growing, and that's like a banquet to certain pests. So there are a lot of pesticides, a lot of fungicides in the farms where these beekeepers are bringing their bees. And also, since there's one thing growing, these bees aren't getting diverse nutrition. They need diverse pollen sources, not just one thing. You have the stress of being on the road, it's really no secret why bees are dying. And these beekeepers are just doing all they can to keep their bees alive in this system of farming that is just poisoning and malnourishing them. The biggest problem that they'll tell you is that there's not a lot of young blood coming into this industry to take up this workload. And so I was fascinated about what they could do following bee biology to keep their bees alive as a migratory pollinator. I was out there for almost 2 years when I got a call from my first boss in Vermont, and he told me that his bees were crashing. He was down to 500 hives from the normal 1,000 that he ran, and he, in a panic, he made some calls, some friends decided to give him some spots in South Carolina, down the coast, to give them hopefully a milder winter, an earlier spring. He didn't have a forklift, so he picked all these hives up, all that he had left, by hand, and shipped them down from Vermont to South Carolina. And he was tied up on the marketing end, doing value-added products with his raw honey. He couldn't find anyone to go to South Carolina to manage them, so here he was calling me, begging me if I could come back and just do whatever I could to save his bees and save his bee business. And me, not knowing any better, said, sure. There's no guarantees in the bee world, but I'll see what I can do. And he stressed the fact that I was going to be all alone. Well, it was March of 2005. I came back east, he dropped me off in the bee yards, wished me luck. I started going through the hives he had brought down, and I had to call him right away and tell him another half of the bees had died. He barely had 200 hives from the normal 1,000 that he ran. He had a white strip in every single box. It was called a checkmite strip. Checkmite was a product called Coumaphos. It's an organophosphate, a neurotoxin, really nasty stuff. I pulled up one of these checkmite strips, and there were varroa mites crawling up and down on the strip that was meant to kill them. The mites had developed resistance. Checkmite replaced Apistan. Apistan was the first chemical treatment for mites in this country. It worked for a couple years, then lost its efficacy, and now I witnessed the failure of Checkmite, which had replaced the Apistan, so neither of these things work anymore. And I looked around, I was 24 years old at the time, I was responsible for millions of little lives, and I really had no idea what I was doing. I explained all this to the boss, and said that this is looking pretty desperate. The next day, 12 liters of formic acid showed up on my doorstep. I'm like, oh gosh, what have I gotten myself into? This is before formic became a legal mite treatment. This was raw formic acid. I had to figure out how to mix it down to the right solution and get some butcher pads. And I held my breath as I dipped these pads in the acid and laid it on the tops of the beehives in a desperate attempt to kill the mites. I put some sticky paper underneath each of the hives, and I came back the next day and I pulled out that sticky paper, and there were literally rows of varroa mites that had fallen from in between the frames. The mite drop was in the thousands. Oh, and I thought this was great. I killed the mites. I'm saving the bees. Then I realized going through those hives that acid had killed a bunch of the eggs, a bunch of the open larvae, a bunch of the young bees, and it killed a bunch of the queens in those hives, along with the mites. And even today, as a registered gel product that's a lot safer to handle, formic acid at the right temperature and the right dosage will be very hard on the bees. In this case, it was a desperate act. It was a last resort. We'll talk a little bit about integrated pest management, of these different preventative measures that you can take, but as a last resort, there are some treatments that will kill mites, even if they are harsh on the bees. So you can imagine like commercial bees in this situation, even if your bees are clean, even if you have all your mite treatments on, these guys never miss a treatment and they never miss a time to feed. Because if they did, the next time they went to their bee yard, they might not have bees left. It's a real tough situation. And you can imagine, even when things are going right and your bees are clean, thanks to global weirding, there is no normal anymore. This is in California last year when it finally started to rain. They couldn't even get the forklift off to unload these bees. This was in Texas a couple of years ago. This is normally a dry holding yard where the bees are safe. It's been safe for generations of beekeepers, but these bees were bubbling out just trying to survive. It was a total loss. So we've got environmental factors. Beyond, it could be worse. This is my idea of sustainable transportation, and the swarm lands on your bicycle. So I look at the problems that we have in the bee world as like a trifocal lens: environment, the methodology, and the genetics. And I'll talk a little bit about each of them, but environment seems to be so important. There's no normal anymore. Things used to run like clockwork. Your bees would start swarming by May, you get your supers on by June, you harvest by July, but that doesn't happen on a regular basis. And these commercial guys, even the ones that are treating and making their mite levels are low, they are just guessing every year. Everyone's just on their toes these days. Environment seems to be crucial to find good, clean forage that is consistent year to year. And so, these days I'm a treatment-free beekeeper. I like this phrase treatment-free but not stupid. Open with that story about mites. Yeah, that was a nightmare situation for sure, but the way that it went was that I was down there we'll focus on this for a little bit. So I was down there, I had cleaned up the mites and picked up what was left from the bees, and I wanted to get this operation down in South Carolina back up to 1,000 hives if possible. We didn't have any queen bees ordered. Typically, commercial beekeepers will order queens that are already mated. They come in the mail in little cages, and you give them a little bunch of brood, a little bit of bees. They get released from their cage. They start laying eggs. They start growing. You have an instant new hive. Well, trying to find queens in the spring, any number of them, is almost impossible. They're already all pre-ordered. So the boss told me that I could just make splits with eggs. I could make what's called a walk-away split. I could take a big hive and just split it in two. Take one of the boxes, put it in a new location. Whatever side was queenless would build the queen in her absence. And then you just walk away. Split the hive in half and walk away. A walk-away split, as if they had swarmed. Well, we didn't really have any hives that were strong enough to do this to. They had been knocked back by the varroa mites and then knocked back by the varroa mite treatment, that they weren't at that swarming, splitting level. So what I did to hurry things up was that I hooked up with a couple local beekeepers, and I did some reading, and I taught myself how to graft. Grafting is the process of taking a tiny tool, picking up a larva from your breeder hive, a hive whose characteristics you want to copy, and putting that larva into a cup, and then putting that cup into a very strong queenless hive. So rather than making that walk-away split, say I got a strong hive, I can split it in two, whatever side's queenless raises a queen, and I get one new queen from the situation. I can go into that same hive, I'll remove the queen, I'll remove the eggs, I'll remove all the larvae, let them sit queenless for a couple hours. This is stressing the bees out. This is fully invasive, manipulative beekeeping here. But after a couple hours of being queenless like that, I will put in this graft. I can put in 40 or 50 of those little queen cups. About 10 days after I do that graft, I will go in, I can get 50 queen cells about to emerge, and I can start 50 new hives that way. So rather than getting one new queen from those resources, I can start 50 through this kind of invasive process called grafting. So the problem was, most people that I realized were using a Chinese push-button grafting tool. It costs all of $2.99 at any bee supply place. And it's a really neat push button. You just slide the larva onto the tongue and slide it into the cup. I didn't have the handy dandy Chinese push button grafting tool. What I had though was a paper clip. And I flattened down one end of this paper clip into a spoon, and I taught myself how to do it that way, but I was doing everything wrong. I was like sliding the larva, just rolling it out of the cells to get it onto the tool, and that was just mashing them up. I was using sunlight to light the larva, and the UV was just frying the little grubs, and so that didn't work. I really tried it 7 or 8 times before I got a queen cell to actually start to grow. And really the only thing that helped me was the Tupelo honey flow, that famous Tupelo honey from the Tupelo trees in the swamps. And to this day, it's one of the most forgiving honey flows I've ever seen. For me, not really knowing what I was doing, trying to get these queen cells started, it was very forgiving. So the queen cells started to work. And then I would take them, I would put them into splits that I made, and they came back from their mating flights and started laying eggs. And then the splits started to grow, and I started having to split the splits I had already made. I ran out of equipment. I had to build frames and put in foundation all night long just to use it up the next day. And I did it day after day after day, raising more and more queens, making more and more splits. It was deep cover, full immersion, solo beekeeping. Until I looked around, I looked at the calendar, I realized it was the start of May. I looked at my list and counted the hives in the yard, and we had over 1,000 hives. And it made me a believer of the regenerative process, especially with this grafting maneuver of getting the numbers very quickly. It made me a believer, a believer. So we picked up these hives, we brought them back up to Vermont, we set them right on the dandelion honey flow, and 2005 was a bumper year. Some of those early queens that I raised went on to lead hives that made over 300 pounds of honey. It was really amazing. The boss told me I had done such a good job, and since I was making less than minimum wage anyway, he said, take 10 hives. From the whole operation, pick out 10. These will be your bees. Find yourself a bee yard. This is your bonus for doing this rescue operation. So I went through, and I had picked 10 hives, some that I already had my eye on, that didn't have the mite levels that I had seen that had tapped the whole operation. They didn't have as much shriveled wing, deformed wing virus. They had more solid brood patterns. They had survived that varroa mite onslaught. And they became the base of the genetic stock that I'm still working with today. And that spring in 2005 was the last time I ever treated any bees that were mine. I say I treat them nice, you know? But as a treatment-free beekeeper, I run anarchy apiaries, and anarchy does not make rules for other beekeepers. I'm not going to tell you to go treatment-free or to stop treating. A lot of my best buddies are treat their bees for varroa because they feel that they have to. You know, I'm not going to tell you what to do in your situation. You know, we can all still be friends. But I will tell you that I am interested in hearing if you have to buy bees every year or if you grow bees every year. If you are good enough at growing bees, then you can start thinking about weaning them off of treatments or off of supplemental feed or steering them in any direction that makes your life as a beekeeper easier. Honeybees are quickly going the route of other livestock, of like cattle hooked on antibiotics, feed supplements, while they are still really on the fringe. Honeybees aren't domesticated. They're still wild to semi-wild. And I hate to see them get more and more dependent on human manipulations. Because, if anything, bees can teach us to have a more wild approach to the way we grow food, the way that we work with nature, and really steer our whole mindset towards working with nature rather than trying to control it. But bees, and if anything, can be profitable being in a semi-wild state. So, I decided, I was totally hooked on raising queens. I saw that as I was going to start a breeding program, not just for varroa mite resistance, but resistance to all the diseases that mites are vectors for, and also for winter hardiness, and really just reverse the trends that I saw the industrial bee world going. But I didn't have any money, I didn't have enough experience, but I had these bees that I had acquired. I took my 10 hives in Vermont, I split them into 18, and I put them into a Vermont winter. Vermont winters typically get 40 below zero. And so for that winter, I answered an ad in the American Bee Journal, and I came down here to Fort Myers. I worked for Dave Mendes out of Fort Myers back when he had 15,000 hives. And I learned the ropes of southern beekeeping management. 4 different species of ants that will wipe out a beehive. You all know what they are? You know? Fire ants will occasionally take out one. Argentinian ants will eat everything, if they can. Bull ants are probably the worst, the big red ants. You've got a weak split, they'll just go in and eat all the live bees. They don't want the brood or the honey, they just want live bees. They'll go in and take over a weak split, and then robber bees will come in and try to rob it out. They'll eat the robber bees while they're trying to rob. Bull ants might be the worst. Then Caribbean crazy ants, which I think are just in small pockets around here. But of course, worse than all of those are the small hive beetles, which, you know, at this point I'd seen all kinds of mite outs and pesticide kills and starvation. Nothing gives me nightmares like small hive beetles. They're not as bad as they used to be. I keep all my bees in full sun, and I could spend days just talking about beetles, but these days I'm watching a beetle try to get into a beehive. The bees are taking the beetle, flipping it upside down, grabbing its legs and flying away with it. They've learned these tricks over the last decade, and I'm starting to feel bad for the beetles, but we still lose one here and there, especially when it rains a lot, but not nearly as bad. So, but then I learned that there's constant nectar, constant pollen coming in year-round, and all the potential, and why so many beekeepers come down here in the winter. So, after like 6 months down here learning about Florida beekeeping management, I went back up to Vermont. I saw that 12 of my 18 hives had survived. I was thrilled. I started calling them survivor stock at that point. And I decided to earn a little capital just to buy me some time. I would go back out and do almonds for one more year. Called my old boss, who was by that point running in Montana and Idaho, and I struck up a deal that I would lease 100 hives under the umbrella of his operation. And so of course I wanted my breeding stock. So I picked my 5 best queens that had wintered in Vermont, and I put them into 5 frame nuke boxes, little cardboard nucleus hives. I put 5 of those in my car, and I drove from Vermont to Montana. About halfway through the second day, the bees were chewing through the cardboard. My little Subaru was filling up with bees. But I made it there to Montana, and I put those 5 hives in an isolated canyon, away from the 5,000 hives I would be working with. And I just started grafting lots and lots every week. I started grafting 2,000 queen cups a week. Selling some extra queen cells, some extra queens here and there. I took the 100 hives, at least split them into 200, and the next spring those 200 hives went to almonds. And suddenly, after years of working at less than minimum wage, I had some capital, a little bit of money that I could use to figure out what I was doing next. So after a year of doing almonds once again, I quit my industrial bee farming job. You know, I wish those guys luck. I gave up the hives I was leasing with. I kept my 5 breeder hives, and I sat down in Montana and wondered what to do next. Suddenly, colony collapse disorder hits the newspapers, and the whole country starts bugging out, literally. I decided it was time to come back east and see what I could do to ramp up my numbers and go and really start a breeding program. And so a bunch of my friends were like buying farms and starting farming. It was really the verge of the local food movement in New York. But I decided to bring my bees to Florida because I knew it would save me years of time. I knew the potential down here. So I brought my 5 hives down here, and I got the last beekeeping job I would have with anyone else, working for the Harveys out of West Palm Beach. They brought 4,000 hives down from New Jersey and also went out to California with them. But I just worked for them as their queen raiser. I lived in Indian Town in the mating yard where there were 800 little 5-frame nukes, and all I did was graft, raise those queen cells, and cage queens. Put them in, once they were mated, I would put them in cages, and those guys would bring them out to the field to split the 4,000 hives. So I was turning a blind eye to all the feeding and medicating and moving bees I didn't want to do anymore. But it was an awesome experience, and looking at these little nukes, I realized that the mites were always really, really low. And I realized what I was doing is that every 3 weeks, I would go into this little baby hive, I would steal the queen and replace her with a ripe queen cell. Now, the virgin queen emerges from that queen cell in a day or two. She runs around in there for about a week before she goes on a mating flight. So every month, there was like a week of no eggs being laid in this little nuke. And what I was doing was breaking the brood cycle. Every 3 weeks, they would have a little brood break, like that. So more than 2/3 of your varroa mites are always inside the brood. That's where they're safe. And as they emerge on an adult bee, the first thing that varroa wants to do is jump onto an open larva and hide in the royal jelly beneath the larva and wait for that larva to become capped, and then the mite cycle repeats. So, if you have a brood break, if you have a period of time where there's no open larva in the hive, those mites have to run around. And bees, all bees, have a biting behavior, they have a grooming behavior, they actually knock the varroa mites off of each other, if they can get to them. So this brood break was enough that the bees' own defenses could knock down the mites. And it all clicks for me in this moment. This is what bees do when they swarm. The old queen leaves with about half the bees, and the entire hive is broodless by the time the new queen gets mated. All the mites are phoretic. They're all running around in there. And the bees are cleaning up a lot of them, able to keep them below a killing threshold without the use of any chemicals or manipulation at all. It's almost like the bees know what they're doing. But of course, from a commercial standpoint, letting your hive swarm is like half of your money flying out to the woods. If you're in an urban environment, a lot of those swarms might get met by a spray can, so it's not in everyone's toolkit just to let your hive swarm. So, in this case of raising queens, commercially, I was simulating that swarming and that brood break behavior. And this is what I started doing to my own bees just through the process of grafting and using queen cells. I took my 5 hives, and in a period of less than 2 months through grafting, a lot of grafting, I was able to split those 5 hives into 170 some little 3-frame nukes, little baby hives. I had a 10-frame deep, I put 2 dividers in there, so I had 3 little baby hives in each box, just like a pickup truck worth of bees. But I was using this special survivor stock, I had gotten all foundation out of there, they were making their own comb, and I had broken the brood cycle. They were healthy and ready to go. I made some calls in New York, put up some signs at health food stores. Suddenly, in the time of CCD, I had 15 new bee yards in the Hudson Valley of New York to work with. I set them right on the dandelion honey flow, and they just took off. They started to bubble out the size of the boxes. I was very proud. And I looked around, and I didn't have another frame, or another box, or anything to put these growing hives into. And I was broke. Again, at that point, I burned through all my pollination money. And it was really at that moment, I think I stumbled on the real mission of anarchy apiaries, to make beekeeping a lot simpler, a lot more affordable, a lot more feasible than it's been for the last 170 or so years. I didn't want to go into $30,000 of debt to buy 200 some Langstroth setups, you know? And I knew my friends were farming, would never do the same, so I really had to do some quick research on what kind of box I could build quickly and cheaply as possible to put my growing bees into. So let's do a little beehive design history lesson. Let's go back before 1852. Before Lorenzo Langstroth patented the movable frame hive that we all know. Before that, there virtually was no commercial bee industry. Honey was rarely bought and sold, if ever. But everyone had a little bit of honey because everyone kept bees. You talk to folks these days, everyone's grandparents, great-grandparents kept bees back on the farm. You had dogs, cats, and bees, and some chickens, you know? I think somehow beehives got replaced by televisions. And I'm serious. I mean, back in the day on the farm, say all your chores are done, you had an hour of daylight left, you go and watch the beehive. It's the most exciting thing. You watch all the different colors of pollen coming in the entrance and things, so we lost that somehow. How did we lose that? Well, the Industrial Revolution came around. Before that, everyone's making their own hives out of just a straw basket of skep, or hollowing out a log, making a gum, or hammering 4 boards together, making a box hive. Everyone had bees, and they kept them for free. The bees were wild. They'd swarm away. Sometimes they'd come back. But with everything getting standardized and modernized, the movable frame hive came into popularity, and now, rather than, like in medieval times, people would sulfur and kill off half their bees to harvest the honey. And they would keep half of them that would swarm back into the skeps, and they did this year after year. But the bees would have to make lots and lots of new wax. Now, rather than having to kill your bees, or having to mash and strain your entire honey crop, you could go into a Langstroth hive, take the frames out, spin out the honey, and give the wax comb back to the bees. The resources, all that nectar coming in, rather than the bees having to make new wax every year, now all that nectar went to surplus honey yields. And the bee industry, the commercial bee world, was born almost overnight because these huge honey yields were suddenly made possible. And it went great. It went great for several decades, until diseases started popping up in these apiaries. They started spreading from hive to hive, and then bee yard to bee yard. Of course, the main one being American foul brood, AFB, still to this day, the most serious bee disease. It's a highly contagious spore-forming bacteria which can't be killed. It can be irradiated, or it can be burned, or maybe treated with ozone. So, in light of this disease, this young fledgling bee industry put pressure on every state government to ban hives that couldn't be inspected. This skep here, this little straw basket, what the public still thinks of as the image of a beehive, is illegal. It's been illegal for more than a century. And because you cannot take it apart, inspect it for disease, and put it back together. And this is why we have bee inspectors, why we register our beehives. And the inspection program is a good thing, because I know commercial guys who couldn't get their foul brood under control, went out of business, and infected all their neighbors. You know, and it still happens to this day. We want to control this disease, because if your hive dies, the neighbor hive robs it out, it'll bring the spores back and get sick. All the hives in the community can get infected by these spores. So keeping this under wraps is why we have bee inspectors, and why you should call your inspector if you ever see something weird. If you ever smell something weird, if you see sunken brood cappings, and if they're gooey, if that where there should be a pupa, instead there's a bunch of goo and it's stringy, like really gooey, like a ½ inch or so of goop, call your bee inspector, or call somebody in the club, because you don't want it to spread. You can even save the bees by shaking them onto brand new stuff, starving their bellies out a little bit, making sure the spores pass through their system, but you gotta burn those old combs and not reuse them. So really, if anything, this problem was caused by movable frame hives, but now everything else was made illegal and people were locked into the Langstroth hive, which is the only legal alternative they were presented with. Beekeeping went from this common thing that everyone did to what it is today. It's an esoteric lost art. Even in our renaissance of recent beekeepers, you know, it's a fraction of a percent of our population now are actually keeping bees. Because rather than building your own stuff for free, so many people had to buy a Langstroth hive, which you all know costs hundreds of dollars just for the equipment. It's not that accessible to a lot of my friends are poor farmers, you know. They don't want to buy this stuff and put some little creatures in there that the newspapers all say are going to die anyway. So it made me think, there must be other ways that I could still inspect the brood nest and keep bees. So I did some quick reading, I did some research, and I read about the Peace Corps in countries like Kenya and Ethiopia promoting what they called Kenyan top bar hives, where they couldn't get the precision milled lumber to build Langstroth. And these things were super easy. It was just a trough. And they were laying sticks on a trough and letting bees build their combs off of these sticks. And so it was an easy to inspect brood nest. And I tell you what, I'm gonna do a magic trick right now. I'm gonna make a Kenyan top bar hive appear out of thin air. It's basically thin air. These are baby pink ones. I have baby blue ones too. There you go. Something like that. Keep it behind the seat of your truck. So these sticks just lay on the top of this top bar. I do give them a little bit of a comb guide. In this case, I've used molding, I've used like an inch piece of wax foundation, and I've often used popsicle sticks. I'll just cut a groove on a table saw and glue in 4 popsicle sticks. Give them a wooden ridge to start their combs on. I remember one year I had to make 5,000 of these top bars. I had to eat 20,000 popsicles just to support my beekeeping habit, you know. These are the things that you do for your bees, you know. So I started making lots of these top bar hives. I tried a bunch of different dimensions, and I really had a lot of fun doing this. And I'm not here to try to convince you all and convert you all to keep your bees backwards. But I will tell you, I've been working in the industry now for years before I started one of these. And this first year that I started top bar hives, I learned so much about bee biology. Just seeing what they could do when left to their own devices, I became a much better beekeeper. So I recommend that you all build one of these. For one thing, that gives you a really nice connection when you build the home yourself from scratch to your beloved honeybees. But you can, even if you're kind of just always run Langstroths, having a top bar just to study and learn from, you could really further develop your understanding of what bees do. And it's just fascinating. So this is a buddy of mine, Kirk Webster. Kirk Webster raises Russian bees up in Vermont for mite resistance. And when I came back up to New York and I started messing around with all these boxes, I went to Kirk to get some breeding stock. He was literally the only person who told me I could keep my bees alive without treating them for varroa mites. Even my friends told me all my bees would die within 2 years, but that was 15 years ago. So, but Kirk does not keep top bar hives. He's a Langstroth beekeeper. This is him working one of my top bar hives. This is like a blackmail photo. You would not be caught working a top bar hive. But I really appreciate Kirk's support. You can read about how he runs his breeding program at kirkwebster.com. He's a really brilliant, brilliant beekeeper. So when I came back up to New York, I started messing around with these hives and putting my bees as they grew into them. And I started bringing in new breeding stock. I got some Russian bees from Kirk that have been shown to have proven mite resistance. That's why the USDA brought them into the country. And I started messing around with all different kinds of hive styles. And the whole point of the top bar was just use what you've got. You know, I would go get some rough cut lumber from the sawmill. I'd bring them jars of honey. They give me twice what I pay for. I know people who make them out of barrels like this. But really, these days, you show me a dumpster, I can build you a couple beehives out of the contents, for sure. So I started raising lots and lots of bees in these things, and when I was harvesting honey, I was cutting the comb off the bar, brushing the bees off, cutting the comb off, and this was my extractor, a stick and a bucket, and straining it through a strainer bag. And I started selling nukes of bees born and raised in top bar hives. So I was selling 5 or 6 combs in a good 3-foot long box, like, to the customers, and I realized I didn't have any extra combs. I was mashing them when I was doing honey, and I was selling them away with nukes. So I was having trouble growing, you know, because that wax really slows the bees down. I think it shortens their lifespan. Wax production is sucking the lipids and fats out of the bees' bodies. I think it makes short-lived bees. So the more resources I could give the bees and keep for the bees, I knew the better. So I decided to really look at how the bees do it and go back towards bee biology. Rather than selling nukes, I started shaking packages. I even stopped calling them packages because they have a bad stigma. I called them shook swarms. And I was really following bee biology because I would go into a hive and see that it was gearing up to swarm. I would go in, I would find the queen, and I would just shake some bees out with it, like 2 or 3 pounds of bees into a box. And you know, I made this cardboard and duct tape funnel. It really fit in with the aesthetics of the rest of the operation. And then I would just let them finish their swarm cells. And I'm like, wow, this is like natural beekeeping or biological beekeeping. I was aiding the decision that the bees had already made. So I started thinking, like, am I still a commercial beekeeper? Is this a bee sanctuary? Am I a natural beekeeper, a biological beekeeper? All these terms were starting to get thrown around as beekeeping was becoming popular. But I was still grafting. You know, I still had these chosen genetics, I was still breeding and tracking families, and I really believed in getting these good genetics out of there and doing some selection. So here's this me grafting into our top bar. It's like anything you do in these backwards boxes, you can also do in a Langstroth. And, all right, this is the Kona Queen operation. I was trying to think of how big do I want to get? Well, I visited them about 12 years ago, back when they were the largest queen producers in the world. They were producing around 300,000 queens a year on the big island of Hawaii. And this was just some of their cell raisers. And their system really impressed me. This was really cool. They had a double nuke system. So there was a queen in this double-stacked nuke here, and a queen in that double-stacked nuke right next to it, and a queen excluder that spanned both of those boxes. So the queens could not get up through the queen excluder to kill each other, but the worker bees could. And they had a pipe going down each one of these rows. That pipe hooked up to a giant mechanical bellows that blew smoke down the length of this pipe underneath each one of these little baby hives. That smoke would push the young bees up through the queen excluder into this top box. And then once they had enough bees bubbling out of that top box, they would slide in a piece of sheet metal and make that top box queenless, getting them ready for the graft. and then they would put a graft in, those queen cells get capped, about 4.5, 5 days later, those queen cells get moved to an incubator, and the process is repeated. And this is how you raise 300,000 queens in a year. I was amazed, this was way bigger than I was ever gonna get, but it was like very, very cool, just the creativity that a lot of beekeepers have. These are some queen cells produced by Michael Palmer. He's in northern Vermont on the Canadian border, and he has top-notch standards. I've learned a lot of queen rearing, a lot of methods from that. More than anything, I think I've just learned to set standards high, because each one of these would be an excellent queen, emerging from these queen cells. Palmer's standards are so high that if one of his hives doesn't make 200 pounds of honey, they'll go in there and kill the queen and replace it with something younger from the next generation. I don't kill my queens, I let them live out their years. If the bees want them gone, they will supersede them naturally. But for those of you who want to make tons of honey, like Palmer does, I mean, that's what his standards are. And it's just inspiring to see what people's programs are to meet their goals. So, this is one of my queens. I took this picture last week. I did not raise this queen. She was actually a gift from the Florida State Beekeepers Association for my bee talk at the state meeting. This queen is instrumentally inseminated. Not by me, but by Dr. John Harbaugh in Louisiana. Dr. John Harbaugh was at the USDA Baton Rouge Bee Lab, and more than 20 years ago, he was one of the guys that discovered a trait, a behavior in bees called Varroa-sensitive hygiene. Basically, bees that have a very acute sense of smell. They can smell when a pupa in the cell is infested by a varroa mite. They will uncap the cell and remove the pupa, like that. And through breeding, this is a selective breeding using instrumental insemination, a very difficult to do process that's kind of invasive. Don't judge me for this, It's not something I do, but when we talk about genetics, if you're not raising in isolation, like Buddy Kirk Webster, who I showed, he goes halfway up a mountain. Some people can find an island to do isolated mating, or if you really are breeding for a specific purpose, in this case, Varroa-sensitive hygiene, instrumental insemination was a tool that they used to perfect these genetics. So, and this genetic line, it's not a breed of bee, but it's a trait that they've augmented and bred for, this acute sense of smell. This is one of the best domestically available traits of bees that you can get. So if you see Varroa-sensitive hygiene, VSH, is being advertised, it was bred, developed at Baton Rouge to be able to cull out mites. And he says that daughters from this queen, this pure VSH queen, even if they mate with drones that are 0% VSH, 50% of those alleles, 50% of that behavior is still enough to keep Varroa below a killing threshold. So domestically, if you're going to be a honey producer, or if you're going to take your bees to almonds, or if you have commercial interests, this is one of the genetic answers that we're going to have moving forward. For the rest of us who just want to keep a couple hives alive in our backyard with minimal inputs, fortunately we're in Florida, where things are really, really good. Some people treat, some people don't treat. Like I said, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I will tell you here in Florida, we have pretty much constant nutrition. We don't have very, very cold winters that are going to cull out all the really sick bees. So with that nutrition, the winters, I think our pupation cycle is a little bit shorter. I think the brood is a little bit sped up here. That helps curtail Varroa. We have awesome wild bees. Yeah, I say it. I don't think the state would want to hear me saying that, but if they're mean, requeen them. If they're not mean, I like them a lot. I get a DNA test on my bees every year. My bee inspector comes out and takes some of the drone pupa from my breeders, so I'm certified European, but I just go out there. I don't wear a veil. I'm in shorts and sandals. If they're mean, I just requeen them, and that's how I do my beekeeping. And it's actually very few that are really, really nasty. Occasionally we'll see one. I tell you see just as many nasty bees up north that aren't considered Scutellata or Africanized genetics. I don't use the word Africanized. Scutellata is the breed of bee that people are concerned with, but they're not all mean. I will tell you that. So I had these genetics and I was accruing more, the Varroa-sensitive hygiene, the Russian bees, and the local bees. And so I started messing around with different kinds of boxes. I started putting hives into winter to try to get them to survive. And I started developing like a New York hardy gene pool, and I started having a Florida gene pool as well. So I stopped moving bees up and down the coast, and these days my bees stay put, and I just like zip up and down and try to keep up with them, you know, shotgun beekeeping. But one winter, about 7, 8 years ago, we didn't have much of a winter, and I had over 90% survival on my New York stock, and it was the first year I had over 500 of my own hives, mostly in these horizontal top bars. And I just couldn't keep up with them. A horizontal hive, you know, even if you have empty room towards the back, if they hit a wall of honey, they can feel congested. And that was really the only problem I ever had with horizontal hives, is that they get honey bound, and they can swarm even if they have empty space. So you want to get in there every 10 days or 2 weeks and drop one of these empty bars into the middle of the brood nest, give those young bees something to work on. But with hundreds of hives, I just couldn't keep up with them. So I started swapping around my hive design, something that I could run a little more vertically, but still raise queens in, until I came up with the system I'm working with now. And this was inspired by a beekeeper in France named Émile Warret. In 1940s France, he wrote a book called Beekeeping for All. It's a free download, you can get it at biobees.com. He tried hundreds of different hive designs until he came up with something like this. It was basically a hollow tree. And he would only go see his bees twice a year. This tall, skinny hive, he would lift it up in the spring and put an empty box underneath. So the bees always had room underneath them and they could keep working down. Then in the fall, he would come and he would cut off the top box and harvest the honey. His entrance was down low, and so they were moving the brood nest down towards the entrance. And whether your hive is vertical or horizontal, the bees tend to like to keep their brood nest close to the entrance. That's where they can ventilate it the best. They keep their honey furthest from the entrance. That's where they can guard it the best. So this is like an eternal hollow tree. The bees are always moving their brood nest down, and when you're taking the honey off of the top, you're also removing the oldest comb. But Warret said, just bees know best. Leave the bees alone, let them swarm. Bees are better beekeepers. And that has really resonated lately with a lot of people who want to save the bees. The problem is they're getting these commercial bees, putting them into this Warret box, and they never open them. Unfortunately, today is not the same as 1940s France. We've got parasitic mites that are vectoring all kinds of nasty diseases. We've got a tainted environment that bees either aren't getting clean forage or not enough forage, and often they're not making enough to survive in their first season while they're building up. And beyond all the environmental problems and the pest pressure, I really recommend people split their bees, learn about bee biology and become better beekeepers and propagate their own survivor stock. And like I said, you know, don't buy bees. You know, do you grow bees every year or do you buy bees every year? You know, when you buy somebody else's bees, you're buying somebody else's problems. Which is okay if that's the only way you want to get into it, and you can get into it if you're not catching any swarms, if nobody's giving bees away this month at the club. You know, if you're going to buy bees, that's fine, but just know that they're going to come with mites on them. And those mites could either kind of stay at status quo, or they can really take over the hive in this first season. So you kind of want to get a sense of what's going on, and that involves opening up your hive. So I decided to change the Warret box dimensions. I really like the philosophy and approach. I just wanted to be a little more progressive on my management. I changed the dimensions. I made them only 6 inches deep as opposed to 10 inches. And I have a whole different philosophy of going in there and inspecting them. So people told me, since I changed the dimensions and changed the whole methodology, stop calling them Warret hives. I should just call them comfort hives. Well, I'm not over the pretentiousness yet to call them comfort hives, my last name, but I can still call them little box hives. And I was cutting these little top bars and laying them on a bar rest I would staple in there until I came across this. This is the forefront of beekeeping technology. It's a barbecue skewer. I got it at Publix. You know? And I snip this skewer down to 11 inches, and the bees make their combs on this barbecue skewer pretty perfectly, most of the time. I don't wax them or do anything like this. It was pretty unbelievable when I came across it. So when I went with the barbecue skewer, I realized I'm building the entire hive without using a table saw. I just have a chop saw, this is pretty easy to make just with hand tools. So I have about 80 cents of lumber, invested in the lumber in this box. So I started making lots and lots of these things. My lid was a shiny piece of bubble wrap, like that, also just pennies, and that bubble wrap just peels right off. And when the boxes are only 6 inches deep, there's really no side attachments. You can go through the whole hive without using a tool. It's like that. I use a little butter knife if there's ever a side attachment like that. So this is one of my mating yards down in Homestead. I started making lots and lots of these boxes. This is close to a beer dispensary. You can see the Budweiser truck right there. I think the fumes from the beer help ensure proper mating of the queen bees. I started organizing my mating yards. This is another one down in Boca and stuff, so lots and lots. I worked up to about 1,800 mating nukes last year. And let's see, I'll flip this up so you can get a sense of what these actually look like. Yep, it happens. Colony collapse. So that's me and my friend Tuckabee. A lot of you know her. She was here last year. We sit on these little red wagons. And basically, the way that I have this organized now is that there are 3 sets of mating nukes, and I work 1 set a week. So 1 set this week, the next week, the next week. 3 weeks go by the time I am back. What I mean by working the set, say I have 300 little mating nukes, and I see I have the center divider in here now, so I have a little baby hive on this side and one on this side. We'll go in there, I'll find the queen, I'll put her in a cage. Every week I go to the post office with a big stack of buzzing envelopes. They think it's weird, I think it's weird. But I bring them a jar of honey that the queens tend to get there on time. And then we put in a queen cell the next day, and then 3 weeks go by the time we're back. By the time 3 weeks go by, that new queen ought to have gone mating, and if she was successful, she would come back and start laying brood. And by the time 3 weeks go by, she ought to have her own capped worker brood. That way I'm sure that she mated well, and she's ready to go out to the public, to the other beekeepers I'll ship her to. So, say I get 100% mating. I'm 300 nukes a week. If it's 100%, I'll get 300 queens in little cages. And these little nukes are so small, I need to cut them back so they can go another 3 weeks. So I will pull out a comb of brood here, give them an empty skewer, so they have room for the next 3 weeks. So I'll get 300 mated queens, and I'll get 300 little tiny combs of brood every week. You can imagine the constant equipment crisis. I mean, this is like a brood factory. I'm actually more interested in harvesting the brood than I am the queens. But we never get 100%. You know, the queens don't make it back all the time. They could get eaten by a bird or a dragonfly. They could get hit by a plane or struck by lightning. You know, it's high trauma when a queen leaves the hive. But we typically get about 80%, often over 90%. And after we break the brood cycle a couple times, the mites are virtually non-existent. Not only are the mites really low from that brood break, it's like super brood. That break in the egg laying, there's no open larva for a week for those young bees to feed that are in this little baby hive. And so their hypopharyngeal glands swell. Those are the glands that produce royal jelly. By the time the new queen starts laying, that new brood is very, very well fed. It's like super brood. And I figured this brood is going to have these nurse bees that are going to emerge, and they're going to be full of protein. And they're going to be able to make lots of really high-quality royal jelly. Those are the bees that I want raising the next generation of queen cells. I know this gets very confusing in how I describe this process, but bear with me for a little bit. So I've made this into a self-contained system that every week I'm getting a bunch of brood like this. I figured that that's the brood I want to go into my cell raisers. So I designed a cell raiser box to take the brood from the mating nukes. And I graft into a box like this every 7 days. We graft every Monday. Every Monday, I put more brood in the front. This box is always queenless. It starts the cells and finishes the queen cells. It's always broodless, just every week I put more of this young emerging brood in, and a new graft. I'll move last week's graft and last week's brood towards the back, and in the front, those gaps here are where I put in one of my little grafting frames. So I even built these little tiny cutesy grafting frames, and we're big on cuteness around here. And I always graft 35 to 40 or so into this little box, because we're going for artisanal queens. We could do more, but we want them to be high quality. So after a couple weeks of boosting these boxes with more brood, they start to look like this. If you're going to be doing production queens, this is what you want your cell raisers to look like. More young bees than will fit into that box. This will make really good quality queens, like so. So every 7 days we work these, we put more bees into them, and we get more queen cells out of them. So I simplified this to the point that I know what I'm doing every single day of the year. And believe it or not, this is taking a lot of stress out of queen production. Because every Monday, we are going to those big cell-raising hives, we're putting more brood in and a new graft. Every Tuesday, we start catching queens. And that first bunch of brood we get, we take that brood and we bank it. We put it above a queen excluder. Because I want that brood to age so there's no eggs or open larvae on that brood by the time I put it into the cell raisers. You know why? If there's any open larvae or stuff, they will make rogue queen cells. If I miss one of those queen cells, that queen will emerge and she will kill my entire graft. That's never happened to me before. I always catch every single queen cell. No, I'm just kidding. But, you know, that's why queens are expensive. But, so I take this brood and I bank it above a queen excluder for next week's graft. Then Wednesday we finish catching the set. Then Thursday, those ripe queen cells go in. Those queen cells are 10 days old. They're from the previous week, the previous Monday. So we're banking brood for next week's graft. We're using the queen cells that were grafted the previous week. And we repeat this. I do 12 weeks of this in Florida, and I do 12 weeks in New York. Like I said, I know what I'm doing every day of the year. And this is, I actually need structure in my life, believe it or not. This really helps. And it's actually made it a lot of fun because every week I get to see how many queens I can get. This was a perfect graft, 40 for 40, on that little grafting bar right there. You can see the little wax rings on the queen cups. And you want to see how good quality I can make the queens. You know, well-fed, plump larvae. This pupa, this would have been a good one if I hadn't mashed it open. And so, all right, you want to go like further down the rabbit hole, just indulge me for a second. This is one of my mating yards down in Miami. I have 300 nukes here, and yeah, further down the rabbit hole. So I'm tracking different families. Each one of those cell raisers has a different family. And so each one of these little florets of mating nukes, this is the aerial view, is dedicated to a different family line. And that little one that's in the center of each one of these circles is the brood bank. And I'm tracking which family's brood goes to which cell raiser. So say this is family number 1, that's brood bank number 1, it goes to cell raiser number 1. So the genetic line is always contained among familiar bees. I hope this would give them better cell acceptance, better care of the virgin queen before she goes mating, and epigenetic benefits. Epigenetics is this idea that environment influences genes and the way that genes are expressed. It really throws a lot of conventional breeding out the window. Basically, epigenetics means if you have a white horse and pink black stripes on it, its offspring will be a zebra. Not literally, but that's some of the basic ideas of how context and how environment can influence gene expression, and that expression of genes is inherited by the next generation. It's kind of cutting edge genomic stuff. But I don't know, I'm just making all this stuff up. So, all right, well, going back and bringing this full circle, with knowing what I'm doing on this weekly schedule, I've been able to open up the mating yard and have people come on over, like beekeeping friends with some bee experience, maybe some grafting experience. I've always promoted that this is a much better way to make a living than sending your bees to the almond machine or trying to make honey for a living. I don't really know anyone who does that anymore. Almonds are killing bees left and right, and they're coming back compromised with all kinds of super mites and fungicide exposure. I just stay at home, I wear shorts and sandals, and I play with baby hives, and I do just as well these days. So I'd like to teach people how to simplify queen rearing and how you can up your queen game, and I do this little 4-day workshop showing the grafting, showing how we bank the brood and catch queens, and how it can be repeated. And so after 4 days, this is my buddy Aaron from Jennings Aviaries in Louisiana. He came down and took the 4-day queen intensive. And at the end of 4 days, he looked at me and said, "This is way too much work. I'm just going to buy queens from you." Oh, it's really, I've been trying this for over 15 years, and I thought this was as simple as I could possibly make it. I'm having fun at it. you know? And then I started thinking, you know, this is too much work. This is pretty complicated and not for everybody. And there's so many backyard beekeepers now. How do we make this accessible to the masses that we can all be breeding bees? All